Hey everyone, today we need to talk about the biggest taxpayer fraud scandal in modern American state history. And it starts somewhere you'd never expect. So just imagine this with me. It's 2014. A former Minnesota state trooper named Jay Swanson takes a new job, not chasing speeders anymore, but chasing money. He's hired to run a fraud investigations unit inside the Minnesota Department of Human Services, the agency that moves billions of dollars in Medicaid and welfare money every single year. And within a few years, his team finds something that stops them cold. Not a few bad actors padding invoices, coordinated networks, organized, systematic, and pulling untold millions out of programs meant for the poorest people in the state. So Swanson does exactly what an investigator is supposed to do. He reports it up the chain, and that's the moment everything changes. His team isn't thanked. They're ordered to delete findings from their own reports. The department hires an outside consultant, not to investigate the fraud, but to discredit the investigators. By 2018, the unit is gone. In Swanson's own words, their only goal was to destroy our unit. But here's what nobody is connecting. Buried in this story is one detail about a single telephone line inside that building. And once you see it, you'll understand exactly how $9 billion may have walked out the door. Because what those investigators found in 2014 didn't stop when they were silenced. It grew. It grew into the largest fraud investigation in America, into a number 36 times bigger than anyone first imagined, and it just ended the career of a man who came within a few million votes of being vice president of the United States. So here's what happened after they shut Jay Swanson down. Because Swanson's people didn't all go quietly. One of them, a digital forensics supervisor named Scott Stillman, walked into the Minnesota legislature in 2018 and said it out loud. On the record, I stand by my claims about the $100 million. It could be higher. I stand by my claim that this money is going overseas into hands that could be detrimental to the United States. $100 million. Going overseas. Said to lawmakers' faces 8 years ago. And what did Stillman get for it? He says his career was destroyed. He spent years effectively in hiding. The warnings were now public, sworn, and specific, and the money kept flowing. Then, on a January morning in 2022, the FBI kicked the doors in. 200 agents fanned out across the Twin Cities and raided an organization called Feeding Our Future, a nonprofit that was supposed to reimburse meal sites feeding low-income kids during the pandemic. On paper, its sites were serving thousands of meals a day, every day. In reality, prosecutors found many of those meals never existed. The sites were invented, the meal counts were invented, the children's names were invented, roughly $250 million, federal money meant to feed hungry kids, gone in what prosecutors called the largest pandemic-era fraud scheme in the entire country. More than 70 people were charged, and in March 2025, the woman at the center of it, Feeding Our Future founder Amy Bach, was convicted by a federal jury. Now stop and do the math on the timeline. Swanson's unit flagged coordinated fraud networks in 2014. Stillman testified about $100 million in 2018. Feeding Our Future exploded in 2022. The people who saw it coming weren't just ignored, they were removed 8 years before the handcuffs came out. And remember that telephone line I mentioned? It existed for exactly this, a way for employees inside the building to report exactly this kind of theft. People used it. What happened when they did is the part of this story that should genuinely scare you, and we're getting there. But first, you need to understand something bigger. Because here's the thing about Feeding Our Future. The $250 million that shocked the nation, the biggest pandemic fraud in America, federal prosecutors now say that was never the real story. While every camera in the country was pointed at fake meal sites, something far, far larger was billing the state of Minnesota in plain sight. Take one program. Minnesota launched something called Housing Stabilization Services, Medicaid money to help disabled and homeless residents find housing. Projected cost, about $2.6 million a year, modest, targeted. Last year, that program paid out more than $100 million, not 36% over budget, roughly 38 times the projection. Prosecutors started charging people who, they allege, billed the program while providing nothing at all. And it wasn't just housing. Two defendants were charged with defrauding the state's autism services program, accused of hiring unqualified behavioral technicians and billing for work with children that didn't happen as claimed. Then came December 18th, 2025. First Assistant U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson stood at a podium in Minneapolis and put a number on it that changed everything. 14 separate Medicaid programs in Minnesota, all flagged as high risk for fraud, had billed $18 billion since 2018. And how much of that did the federal government's lead fraud prosecutor believe was fraudulent? His words, "When I say significant amount, I'm talking on the order of half or more. Half or more. of 18 billion. That's how you get to the estimate that fraud in Minnesota could top $9 billion. Sit with that number for a second. Feeding Our Future, the scandal that produced 70 indictments and national headlines, was 250 million. 9 billion is 36 Feeding Our Futures, stacked on top of each other, in one state of under 6 million people. Thompson didn't hedge either. What we see in Minnesota is not a handful of bad actors committing crimes. It's a staggering industrial scale fraud. It's swamping Minnesota and calling into question everything we know about our state. And how did Governor Tim Walz respond to the federal prosecutor's estimate? He called it sensationalized, a weaponization, a number created by the Trump administration. His own Medicaid director said the state had evidence of tens of millions in fraud, not billions. Maybe. The investigations will settle that. But here's what can't be waved away as politics. By the time Thompson stood at that podium, the telephone line inside DHS, the one built so employees could safely report exactly this, had already been quietly turned into something else entirely, something no one outside the building knew about. Because to understand how a fraud estimate reaches $9 billion, you don't follow the money. You follow what happened to every single person who tried to report it. Meet Faye Bernstein, nearly 2 decades inside the Department of Human Services, working contract management and compliance, the person whose literal job was making sure state money followed the rules. Starting around 2018, she began flagging what she described as illegal contracting practices. She raised it internally, then she escalated it, by her account, all the way to the governor's office and external oversight bodies. So many times, she said, it became embarrassing, like a broken record. And what did 2 decades of service and years of warnings buy her? Her credentials were revoked. She was trespassed, legally banned from every DHS-owned or leased property in the state. And she was walked out of the building in front of her colleagues. Listen to how she describes it. It's the kind of thing that sends such a chill to everyone who saw me walk down that very long hallway, being escorted out. Anyone who sees that would never want to speak up again. That was the point. But here's the detail that should stop you cold, because it answers the question of who actually gets rewarded inside this system. Bernstein says her own supervisor told her something to her face. I was told by my direct supervisor that he would get a promotion if he stifled me. And guess what? He got a promotion. Stifling a fraud whistleblower wasn't a scandal inside that building. It was a career path. And she wasn't alone. Stillman, career destroyed, years in hiding. Swanson's entire unit dissolved. This January, current and former DHS employees sent an anonymous 7-page letter to Congress saying they'd been flagging fraud and lax safeguards since 2019 and that those warnings were ignored, dismissed, or met with retaliation. Why anonymous? Because according to House investigators, the department's response to whistleblowers allegedly included hiring outside private investigators and law firms to scrutinize them, surveillance efforts, and in one instance, a DHS manager allegedly proposing to use military connections to track down the employees raising fraud concerns. Military connections, to locate their own compliance staff, while $9 billion in suspect billing rolled out the door. Now, you might assume the strongest confirmation of all this would come from a Republican congressman or a prosecutor or some leaked memo. It didn't. The most damning confirmation in this entire story came under oath, on camera, from the man whose administration ran the building. Which brings us to the part they really did not want getting out. Because by late December 2025, this story had escaped Minnesota. A young YouTuber named Nick Shirley posted a video alleging fraud at federally funded daycare operations in the state, and it went nuclear, amplified by the vice president, the attorney general, the most powerful accounts in the country. The Trump administration paused federal childcare funding to Minnesota, and then the dominoes started falling inside the Democratic Party itself. A group of DFL state senators requested a meeting with Governor Walz to voice their concerns directly. A growing number of Democrats, by multiple reports, privately doubted he could survive a third-term campaign. The former chair of his own party, Mike Erlandson, said the fraud issue would be ever-present in all 2026 races. And on January 5th, 2026, less than 4 months after launching his re-election bid, Tim Walz walked to a podium at the state capitol and dropped out of the race. The man who was nearly vice president of the United States, ending his career in a scandal his own employees had warned him about. But the moment that matters most came 2 months later, March 4th, 2026. Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison sworn in before the House Oversight Committee, and under oath, Chairman Comer pressed Walz on the timeline. The agencies raised concerns of fraud for years, correct? And the governor of Minnesota answered, yes, yes. There it is. Not a Republican's accusation, not a whistleblower's allegation, The governor himself under oath, confirming that the warnings existed for years. The committee also pressed him on why his administration didn't pause payments to suspect programs until late 2025 after the federal government stepped in. So line it all up. Swanson's unit found the networks in 2014, silenced. Stillman testified in 2018, career destroyed. Feeding Our Future detonated in 2022, 250 million gone. The estimate hit 9 billion in 2025, dismissed as sensationalized. And in 2026, the man at the top confirmed under oath the warnings were real all along. Every link in this chain is documented. But the full machinery of how the silence was actually enforced, the detail about that telephone line I told you about at the very beginning, stayed buried until 3 days ago. So when you put all of this together, there's really only one conclusion, and it's the one they've spent 12 years hoping you'd never reach. Here it is. On June 8th, 2026, the House Oversight Committee released a 205-page report on Minnesota's fraud crisis, and inside it is the telephone line. The Department of Human Services ran an internal fraud hotline, an anonymous tip line, the official safe channel, the thing every silenced employee was told to trust. According to the report, sometime after 2022, that hotline was effectively de-anonymized, and whistleblowers reported that their tips, their confidential fraud reports, were routed to human resources and used against them. The fraud catching tool became a whistleblower catching tool. And when employees built their own anonymous external email address just to report theft safely, the department blocked it. The report's bottom line: Walls and Ellison were allegedly aware of credible systemic fraud as early as 2019, had the authority to stop payments, and repeatedly failed to act. Now, to be fair, Democrats on the committee call the report political, and Ellison's office points to over 340 Medicaid fraud convictions. Fine. But the governor's yes is under oath. Bernstein's long hallway happened. Swanson's deleted findings happened. So name this pattern for what it is. Minnesota never had a fraud detection problem. Detection worked in 2014, in 2018, in 2019. Minnesota had a detector removal problem. Every alarm that rang got unplugged, and the people who pulled the alarm got escorted down the hallway. You now know more about how $9 billion goes missing than most people watching cable news tonight. And you know it didn't go missing quietly. It went missing over the screams of the people paid to stop it. 12 years ago, a former state trooper found the fraud and was ordered to delete his findings. 3 days ago, a 205-page report put them back on the record, permanently. The findings they ordered deleted refused to stay deleted. Stories like this don't stop, and neither do we. Subscribe and turn the bell on so you don't miss the next breakdown. And drop a comment below. What was the moment in this video where it clicked for you? Stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop asking questions. See you in the next one.